everyone. Welcome back to the latest episode from the Lessons from the Playroom podcast. I do hope that you have something to take notes with today. We are venturing into uncharted territory in the Lessons from the Playroom lineup of topics, and it's a very, very, very I'm going to say very, 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 again, important piece of the puzzle when we are trying to understand what's going on with the children that we are working with. So, what are we talking? We're talking about the connection between psychology and what's going on in the mind and in symptoms with what's going on actually inside the body, the gut, etc. And I have with me today a great friend and a very special guest. I have Dave Hompes, and we were making a joke earlier because I was like, Dave, how do you say your last name? And he was like, it's Dutch. He was like, but just say it like I'm Latin. So there you go. So Dave, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I want to share a little bit about your bio before we get going on the conversation. So everyone, Dave is an author, nutritionist, functional medicine practitioner, and mind-body coach with extensive expertise in integrative approaches to health. During a career spanning almost 25 years, he's worked with clients from all ages, many backgrounds, from the wee ones all the way on up through the elders. He's also worked with professional athletes and celebrities. He employs a wide range of therapeutic methods to help people overcome digestive, hormonal, immune, detox, neurological, and energy-based imbalances. He has a multidimensional view of human nature, which, Dave, I appreciate this about you so much. He considers biological, philosophical, psychological, social, and spiritual aspects in his work. He has recently founded the Higher Minded Health Academy with the goal of training how do you say this word? Polymathically minded health and well-being practitioners. I do know what the word means, but I didn't know how to say it. So for those of you that don't know what a polymath is, Dave, will you share what a polymath is?
Yeah, it's someone who either excels in a wide range of different areas. I don't claim to be a polymath. I claim to study polymathically. I think it would be a little bit arrogant to say that I'm a polymath. And so what the polymathically minded practitioner is, in my mind, is somebody who wants to come at a problem from different angles and understand that there are different toolkits and different pathways into addressing problems in the body and the mind, and that there isn't one kind of magic, one size fits all approach out there for any symptom, really. You could have an anxiety or a depression or a digestive issue for various reasons. And if you're thinking about it polymathically, you're not just nailing yourself to the cross, so to speak. You're actually thinking, stepping back and trying to find the right solution for the person who has the problem. And so you're familiar with the law of the one and the many, which comes from Greek philosophy. You can have one symptom and there can be many reasons for that symptom in different individuals. And so that's a really important thing to grasp and understand. And I think as we go through our little discussion this evening, that will become apparent to people. Because with the wee ones, as you call them, I don't work extensively with pediatric clients and their parents, but I've had enough experience to know that it can be a huge piece of the jigsaw puzzle.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, it's all about trying to figure out, rather than saying, I have the perfect model, you must live by it. It's more like, okay, we've got a load of different models in our mind. Which one is going to be the one that fits this person the best, or which combination?
I think that is such a beautiful introduction for a couple of reasons. One is play therapists, we get stuck in only thinking about symptoms from a psychological perspective. So that's why I'm so tickled that we're going to bring in the biology from multiple aspects to round out the conversation a little bit more. and to get play therapists thinking outside of the boundaries of, oh, I just have to stay in the realm of psychology in order to handle the situation. And we're going to do something that we haven't actually done in the podcast, which is that we're going to have 4 case studies, and we're going to go through each one of these case studies, and you're going to help us have this polymathic perspective, I guess, and look at it. I used the word correctly. Right? And help us think about this, what might be going on inside of the body. So what a beautiful way to get into this. Anything that you want to share before we jump into a case study?
Yeah, I think just what you said about you can get stuck in psychology if that's where your main training is. Nutritionists can get stuck in nutrition, and functional medicine practitioners can get stuck in functional medicine and not realize that there is a mind-body component, and that sometimes the physical symptoms, aches and pains, digestive issues, things like this, skin problems, can actually be psychological in origin, not in the sense that people are making the symptoms up. Psychosomatic has this bad rap now. The word psychosomatic means mind to body. Many people sort of hear it and squirm a little bit and think, well, that means the doctor is saying to me that I'm making things up, that the symptoms are all in my head. But actually what we're saying is the mind and the body interact with each other in both directions. So people who have what you might call psychological symptoms, the origins of those may be in biochemical imbalances that can be treated nutritionally and with supplements and with things like that. And likewise, or conversely, you can have people with symptoms in the body that respond amazingly well when you actually use psychological techniques with them, whatever they may be, whether it's meditation or whether it's cognitive therapy or whatever. So I think it works both directions. I like to say, like, there's a highway. I'm from Leeds in Yorkshire, which is in the north of England, and we have the motorway, the M1, that goes down to London and back up. It's about 200 miles, which is nothing in your grand old US of A. It's like just village to village. Here, it's like a 2.5 hour drive, but you go both directions. There's a northerly direction, there's a southerly direction. So I always say that the brains are in Leeds, obviously, and then the guts are in London. And so basically, there's a two-way communication pathway between the guts and the brain, or the body and the brain, and they affect each other, and you can't separate them. You just need to ask the right questions and run the right analyses to figure out in each person where the real origin of the problem is.
Okay.
And it could be the mind or body or a bit of both, and you never know until you get going and get into the case study and or the case history and look at how everything's developed.
Well, let's jump in.
Cool. So the first case study, I thought we'd use, by the way, with the case studies, we'll do high level overview. I won't go into intricate detail with all the molecular biology, partly because I don't understand all of it myself, because you can go too far into the minutiae of it and get caught up down there instead of, stepping back. But also I always would want to protect the identity of the people that we worked with. I'll keep them broad. So this case study is, or was a few years ago, a 2.5-year-old who had been struggling with epilepsy and was having multiple seizures during the day, every day, more than a dozen. And so the medical system had basically said this was intractable or recalcitrant, meaning that it was not responding to any of the treatments that they had tried. I'm not an expert in epilepsy drugs or treatments. So I worked alongside a medical doctor with this one who was a friend of the family. And within the first consultation, we basically I asked, well, when did this actually start? Sometimes there's a clue in a simple question.
That is such an important question, play therapists, to find out when your kid has a symptom, when did it start? It's such a critical question.
When did it start? And I'm sure it was they'd asked before, but if you don't have knowledge in nutrition, the answer won't make sense to you as it did with me. My value is nutrition. So the spidey senses tingled straight away with this one. They said when he was weaned, okay, so he's gone from mother's milk to food and he's developed epileptic seizures. Could there be a link? It's worth asking the question whether there is or not. And so not all epilepsy is going to be related to nutrition. My mum had epilepsy and it happened after menopause. So she'd gone through 50 years of her life without an epileptic seizure. So it's not always to do with nutrition. There are many factors involved. But I had seen some videos online by a neurologist who's an American neurologist named Dr. David Perlmutter. And he's actually quite well known in the functional medicine world. He's written some books. So David Perlmutter, well worth looking up and just having a root round in his work. And he'd shared 4 or 5 case studies in a particular video in which a gluten-free diet had cured epilepsy. So anecdotal evidence, as it's called in the scientific community, no double-blind placebo-controlled study, which is the gold standard of science, but it seems as though some people do really well when they have epilepsy if they go gluten-free. So they took that information to the pediatrician, who was one of the leading pediatricians in the UK, pediatric neurologist, I should say, in one of the London hospitals. And condescendingly, he kind of just said, well, that's not really how we do science, meaning these are just anecdotes. They're case studies. There's no real scientific validity behind this claim that a gluten-free diet can help epilepsy. And then there followed one of the most exhausting consultations of my career with the medical doctor, who helped greatly, trying to get the family to just try it because it seems so obscure. If the leading pediatric neurologists in the UK don't recommend this, why should I listen to you, kind of thing? And so it took about an hour and a half until we eventually agreed that that's what they were going to try. Now, there was another clue here, which was he also had some digestive problems, some sort of loose stools and diarrhea. And so that was another clue that maybe, because gluten can affect the gut as well. So it was basically after that 90-minute consultation, walked out of there drenched in sweat, just exhausted, give me a stiff drink. And they went away and tried it. And lo and behold, the seizures declined very quickly the next day. And then within a week, they'd basically stopped completely. And then I checked in a few weeks later and they hadn't returned. So that was a very, you don't always hit the nail on the head with these cases. That was just a really cool one that we just hit the magic button and things normalized virtually overnight. So there's some interesting aspects to that case. And one of them is when we're talking about a polymathic approach to health, one of the things we've got to look at is societal perceptions around what can and can't cause symptoms and disease. And my view about what can and can't cause symptoms and disease is drastically different from somebody who's trained in conventional Western medicine. They're not taught about nutrition at all. They get maybe half a day in 5 or 6 years of training on nutrition. So they don't really get to understand how food affects the body, how nutrients affect the body. They do recognize certain nutrients as being problematic. So iron, they recognize iron deficiency anemia. They'll recognize B12 deficiency, and they recognize vitamin D. But they're just 3. Oh, folate and folic acid, of course, for pregnancy. There's a link there. So they'll dabble in those 4 nutrients when the need arises, but there are dozens of nutrients, and they can all potentially be influential in people's health, disease, symptoms, illnesses, etc. But with the gluten, celiac disease is a disease that many people have heard of vaguely. Gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance is something that a lot of people have heard of vaguely. The problem with gluten is that it's become a little bit of a fad. And so it's like all the celebrities do it. I'm gluten-free, I'm gluten-free, but nobody really knows why it's useful to go gluten-free. And you know all about gluten-free because I
I
think
do, because
you
it
struggle with
affects
gluten.
my stomach. It sure does.
You struggle with gluten, and other
Yes.
people I know struggle with gluten. It doesn't affect everybody. It doesn't affect people in the same way. There's a continuum of effects from very severe down to relatively minor. But what it does is it stimulates an inflammatory response in the intestine. And it increases something called, I don't want to get too technical, tissue transglutaminase 2. And that's the digestive version of celiac disease. And it wears away the intestinal lining over time, and it leaves you unable to absorb your nutrients effectively. And so people can become very nutritionally depleted with that. What a lot of people don't realize, and not even myself for many years, even when I was doing this work, is that gluten can stimulate two other types of tissue transglutaminase, which affect other parts of the body, not just the gut. There's tissue transglutaminase 3, which can affect the skin, and that can lead to a condition called dermatitis herpetiformis, which is a rash-like condition on the skin. Or you can have tissue transglutaminase 6, which affects the nervous system and the brain. And they've shown that this was an article on the NHS, which is the National Health Service website in England, that said that up to 2/3 of people with celiac disease literally have brain damage at the time of diagnosis. It's not severe, and it may not be enough to even create dysfunction, but it's there. And so it's a massive issue, this.
I have a question,
Yeah.
because I've noticed this from my own physiology, and then also other individuals that I know that learned that they couldn't eat something. So I know we're talking about gluten right now, but let's just say other sensitivity, egg, milk, like whatever it is. But it does also seem to affect psychology. It
Yep.
does seem to affect anxiety, irritability, even depression. Will you just make the link a little bit there
Yep.
about why inflammation would affect
There's,
psychology?
there are a number of different mechanisms by which all that can happen. It's quite tough to list them all, but we'll sort of do a high level overview of them. But if you've got the tissue transglutaminase 6, will go kind of hand on hand or hand in hand with a little bit of brain inflammation. You don't know which particular area of the brain might be affected, and whatever part of the brain that's affected may create different symptoms. So with people with gluten, there are, again, like epilepsy, there are case studies where people have been completely paralyzed down one side or lost the use of an arm, and then that's just come back on a gluten-free diet. It can be that extreme. But depression is a really common symptom with gluten-based inflammation in the brain. Anxiety, brain fog,
That was
memory,
mine. Brain fog was
memory,
mine. Woo,
yeah,
memory. Woo.
cognitive and memory issues, ADHD. And so surely we want to be looking at these things if kids are eating these kinds of foods a lot prior to putting them on Ritalin and things like that. You guys have a crazy number of kids on these meds at the moment, from my understanding. And the problem's blamed on the kid's nervous system rather than their social environment. But the nervous, and that might be right. It might be the nervous system that's the problem, but it's certainly not a Ritalin deficiency. You've got to look at the diet first. It's really important. And some of the other case studies we'll go through are obviously really great at highlighting that as well. And so if you've got a bit of brain inflammation from the gluten, that's one thing. But the brain can become inflamed for other reasons. So if you have damage to the digestive system from the foods you're eating, the immune system doesn't like those foods. It reacts against them, and that creates inflammation in the digestive tract. You can also have inflammation from chronic infections, which again are very poorly covered within the medical world. It's like, if you think about chronic infections, HIV is probably the main one. H. pylori, which lives in the stomach, which is what got me into this work, because that's the one I had. That can create problems, but there are a stack of other organisms, bacteria, yeast, fungi, mold, parasites, that can hang around in there and create a little bit of inflammation. You might have a little bit of an upset stomach, but you might not really think to look there. But what happens is the barrier of the intestine, call it the intestinal mucosal barrier, can get damaged and broken down. And when that happens, the blood-brain barrier can also be broken down. A useful little saying is barriers rise and fall together. So if you've got problems in your digestive system and your intestinal barrier, your blood-brain barrier might get influenced and affected adversely as well. So now you can get more things getting into the brain that shouldn't really be getting into the brain. And now you get more of an inflammatory response in the brain. And that can be from some of these substances, biochemicals that these little critters produce with their metabolism, leak through into the bloodstream, start to get up, affect the nervous system, creep into the brain. The brain says, shit, we need an immune response here. So the immune system gets in there and starts to create an inflammatory response in the brain. And that creates nerve damage. It alters the blood flow, the cerebral blood flow. You get neuronal damage. And then you're opening the door to potentially any psychological symptom as a result of that, whether it's cognitive, emotional, and then obviously behavioral as well. So it's a huge issue. And one of the things that people come to our practice and other functional medicine practices around the world with, is like the number one symptom, brain fog. Just can't think clearly. And then they're astonished to find that that clears up when they change their diet, clean their digestive system up, put some nutrients back in, and it just goes away and they think clearly again. There's never really anything wrong with the brain in the first place. It was the gut that was the issue.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the gut speaks to the brain neurologically, immunologically, and biochemically as well.
Yeah.
And so if you have problems in the gut, you can get a relay up and down the motorway, the highway between the two, creating problems as well. So many roads to the same symptoms. And then finally, if that's not enough,
right.
the intestine is damaged more and it's just not functioning as well as you want it to be, you won't absorb nutrients as effectively. And so you can end up with sometimes quite subtle, insufficient quantities of B vitamins, minerals like magnesium, things that calm the nervous system down, amino acids that are the building blocks for things like dopamine, serotonin, GABA, glutamate, etc. So you can start to get neurotransmitter imbalances in the nervous system as well. Now, the cool thing is you can assess and test for all of this, but you can't do it through regular medical care unless that medical practitioner has trained in this more holistic way. So you can check your nutrient levels, you can check your neurotransmitter levels, you can check your hormone levels, you can check your digestive function, you can check for these infections. You can even check now for the tissue transglutaminase 6 for the brain and nervous system. And you can do much more detailed gluten analyses than just, does this person have celiac disease or not? You can get into much more detail as to precisely what's going on with their immune system and the interactions with gluten. So all the tools are there, but hardly anybody knows they're available. And again, a little bit like the pediatric neurologist in this first case, if you speak to a doctor, they can be very disparaging about this stuff. And a lot of people get put off because the doctor just says, oh, it's a load of nonsense. You know, there's no science behind it. It's just people making a large amount of money off your dysfunction, your ill health, you know, and it's not a great situation. But I always say, look,
we're being educated now. You're educating us, Dave.
Well, yeah, I always say, look, there's one-way traffic. There's one-way traffic in terms of whether people who are trained in nutrition and the healing arts outside the medical system versus the people who are trained inside the medical system. If you go to Amazon and look at all the books in this area, it's usually people who trained in conventional medicine, realized that wasn't working very well, had an epiphany, saw the light, and switched across to applying nutrition, functional medicine, meditation, psychology in their practice and combining that with conventional medicine. I've yet to read a book or even find one where somebody trained in the more alternative and complementary elements of health and then suddenly saw the light and wanted to go and prescribe drugs to everybody. You don't see it going the other direction. So that tells you something. Now, that's not to poo-poo the medical system, and we don't want to criticize it. That's just a certain way of looking at health. And when it doesn't work, we need an alternative way or series of alternative ways of looking at health. And we need to make people aware that they exist so that they can actually leverage them.
Well, let's keep the conversation rolling. Let's go into your next case study here.
Next case study.
Yeah.
So this was a really interesting one. There's an addendum that I haven't told you about yet with this one, because I work with the whole family, the parents and the child. So we'll do the child first. The child was, or still is, obviously a child, but about 3 years old and had been diagnosed on the autistic spectrum. I'm not an expert in autism, but I am good at reading lab work and looking at how results on lab tests and the diet might be affecting somebody's nervous system. So the autistic spectrum is obviously quite broad. I learn a little bit more week by week as I do a bit more reading on it. Some of my friends actually have kids who have been diagnosed on the spectrum as well. But the long and short of this was, again, there was a clue in the conversation, speaking with the parents who were also clients. I said, well, there might be a few things that we can look at. If we run a couple of really broad spectrum tests, there's one called an organic acids test, which is a urine test that you can do at home and send back off to the lab. It has some really great markers that give clues about certain factors that might influence the nervous system of an autistic kid. And we also did a stool test as well. And they'd already done some allergy tests and things and figured a few things out for themselves. But what happened with this case is a couple of things. In the organic acids result, there's a marker called tricarbalic, I can't say it, tricarbaliate, it's also called tricarbalic acid. And that was really high off the chart. And when that's high, it indicates exposure to a fungus or a mold that grows on corn.
I remember this.
There was another very high marker, which is called oxalic acid, which is a potential marker for whether somebody has accumulated too many oxalates in their body. And we'll talk about where oxalates come from in a moment, because it's a bit of I don't want to swear, but it's a bit of a head fuck because it involves very healthy foods that people think they should be eating a lot of. And now and again, it can be causing a lot of problems. Now, I thought that those two markers were pretty good indicators that the nervous system of this kid was not going to be doing very well. And neither would be the mitochondria, which are the energy powerhouses inside our cells. Mitochondrial dysfunction, neurological dysfunction, obviously that has the potential to create behavioral, psychological problems. So what we did, asked about the diet. These guys were from Colombia. There's a traditional corn cake that they eat for breakfast. I can't remember what it's called.
It's called narepa.
Yeah. And so he was eating that every morning, and he had done for 2 years or whatever, however long he'd been weaned. So we ditched that. And guess what happened? Improvement within like 72 hours. We're not talking about autism cured here. We're talking about a notable improvement, change. We then went about lowering the oxalate intake because they were feeding him fruit and vegetable juice, freshly squeezed, not bought, but fresh fruit squeezed. Now, oxalates are high in kale, spinach, and other leafy greens, things like oranges, berries, a whole bunch of foods that you would think are absolutely amazing for health. But in certain circumstances, when they're consumed excessively, and when they are interacting with people's individual genetic makeup and with an issue in the gut that might already be there with an infection or something like that, they can end up taking in too many oxalates and not being able to get rid of them properly. And they can become extremely toxic to the nervous system and the mitochondria. And there's some horror stories with oxalates, actually. And you're going, well, hang on a minute. These are the best foods on the planet that we keep. They're superfoods. They're supposed to be the best things we can eat, yet they can be quite disastrous for some people. Now,
Can
I
I
got,
just say something real
yeah,
quick? Because what you just said there, I think, is really important. Because what you're saying is really alluding to, it's really based on everyone's own unique system.
yeah,
And that's why it's so important to that really there needs to be an individualized approach for everybody's body, everybody's makeup, everybody's, because saying, well, gluten is bad, well, it may be or may not be, right? Kale is, it may or may not be. And so I just want to reinforce that to the listeners that everything really has to come down to who is this person and what's their body.
absolutely. We're
Mhm.
completely unique.
Yeah.
All aspects of our lives are unique, from our genetics to our nutrient needs,
Yep.
to the exposure to environmental influences, whether they're psychological or physiological, as we grow up, stress levels, etc. And it's some mixture of all of that
Mhm.
that leads to the symptoms.
Mhm.
And the lab tests are there to give objective evidence to say, well, looks like there's something going on here on the piece of paper that we get back. But we have to be careful not to get addicted too much to visual information. And we need to listen as well, because
Mhm.
sometimes the stories that people tell us more about what's going on than the fancy lab tests, no matter how many hundreds or thousands of dollars those lab tests may cost. Sometimes just something that somebody says, a throwaway piece of information, it can be sometimes, where you go, just say that again.
Mhm.
And so a combination of listening and looking, you'll find that 10 people with the same symptoms might have all completely different underlying reasons for those symptoms. There's no one-to-one match
Mhm.
at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
And likewise, you could have 10 people with very similar lab results,
Mhm.
and they might all have completely different symptoms.
Oh, that's so good. You don't people,
So
I don't think people tend to think of it that way. That's so good.
it's
Yeah.
both, you could go in both directions. Again, it's like the one and the many thing. And so it's confusing, and
Mhm.
I'm still learning. And
Mhm.
one of the things that frustrates me about our industry is how many industry leaders seem to think or know that they have the answer already. And I just keep doing course after course, reading book after book, working with clients, and just humbled the whole time, going, well, I've learned something new there. I've learned something new there. And sometimes it feels like, I think it was Carl Jung, who said in one of his books, there's another thing I didn't know about myself, I think he said, and it felt like a defeat for the ego.
Mhm.
And every time you learn something new, sometimes you go, I've been doing this 15 years and I should know this. But
Mhm.
keeping humble is the way that we keep growing. And so it's frustrating that the medical system, well, not all, because of some great people, and it's not a staff problem, it's the way they're trained. It's like they think they know it all. And if only they just
Mhm.
open their minds to some of the other stuff that's out there. We all have that tendency, if we're not careful, to just stop and go, I've got it all now.
Well, I mean, you're talking about different approaches in the medical field. We have it in the play therapy field too. Play
Yeah,
therapy, we get attached to one way of looking at it. We get attached to. I mean, I'll even say this in my synergetic play therapy certification programs. One of the last things we do in the course is we actually look at all the downsides, because it's like, no, you have to have a more open minded perspective, and you can't think that one thing answers everything, or one thing is the answer.
yeah.
So Dave, I'm aware that I totally pulled you off track here
No,
as we're in
I'm
the middle
glad.
of your story.
I'm really glad you said that, because that's exactly what I want to do in the functional medicine and nutrition industry, is look at the downsides. Stop patting yourself on the back. Stop thinking you have all the answers. Let's look at all the evidence and the psychology that contradicts other things that you're saying here, so that we
Yeah,
balance the whole thing out,
yeah,
so that we stay open-minded and don't close off to assuming that one thing is causing a symptom when it might be something completely different. So
totally.
going back to the story,
Yes.
um,
Okay.
that case developed, and I wanted to just segue across to the parents, because the mum had some digestive problems. She responded really well to just we found some bad bugs in the gut, and just gave her a protocol to clear those out, and She just did really well with some quite basic work. But the husband and the dad, who was the first, he was the one who contacted me for his own symptoms. He got nowhere using the functional medicine. So he said he had like a 9 out of 10 in terms of intensity, digestive pain, and bloat, more or less all his waking life, should I say. And we did everything according to what the lab test said we should have been doing, cleaned his diet up, etc. He had some bad bugs again, but he just didn't respond to anything for 3 months that we did. And he also had an elevated TSH, which is an indicator of low thyroid, which I know if the thyroid's here, right? Becomes important. And he felt tired and he had to have a nap in the afternoon. And that, I thought, well, that probably could to do with the low thyroid, because the thyroid hormones give you energy. But there was just no improvement whatsoever. So after 3 months, when I'm not really getting anywhere with a client, I start to wonder if there's something else going on, particularly if they're doing everything according to the test results and we're just not, and they're sticking to really good eating and things. We've got to be missing something. So I just had a quick word with him during one of the consultations about mind-body connection. And the following week, when we came back, I said, "How are you feeling?" He said, he looked really sheepish. "How are you feeling?" "All my symptoms have gone." I said, "Okay." He said, "I took on board what you said about the psychology and the mind. And I found somebody, I called her up and I did a 60-minute healing session with her. And he told me this whole story came out that I'd not been aware of. And he said, 7 years ago, and this number seven's quite cool esoterically. He said, 7 years ago, I was stabbed numerous times outside a nightclub. I said, "That's interesting." So there's a trauma element there. Exactly. And he said, the lady helped me work through the trauma and the digestive symptoms disappeared. Exactly. Just disappeared and haven't come back. Yeah. And so then he said there was another trauma that we worked on, which was my mom. And his mom had muscular dystrophy. So he grew up, as he was growing up and developing, his mom was losing her use of her muscular system. And there was a point where she had to be intubated with a tracheostomy in here.
Where the thyroid is.
Where the thyroid is. And he'd not put that part together because he was stabbed in his abdomen. So the digestive symptoms were a symbolic representation of the trauma of being stabbed. And then the symbolic thyroid issue with his mum's tracheostomy. And I was just blown away with this case. It was like, well, because you and I have seen some pretty cool things with mind-body healing and things. I've experienced it myself, but this one was like a really huge one for me.
I want to make a connection for our listeners. So there are times when you do have your clients and you take them through the play therapy process and you resolve the trauma and the symptoms disappear. We see that one, right? But don't take your eye off of that one. That's my message is make sure that you're tracking the connection between what you're working on and what's happening in the body. And then with the conversation that's happening today, also, I want you to be thinking about what's happening in the body and how that might be influencing what's happening in the mind, because that's a piece that we don't talk about at all, really, in the play therapy world. So, Dave, we have time for one more case study. Would you jump to the one around anxiety, since
I think
definitely. That'd be a really great one.
The third one was about neurological tics and a prognosis of Tourette syndrome, and that was connected to the gut. So he had a Clostridium difficile infection, and the toxins that bacteria produces get into the bloodstream, and they block the activity of the enzyme that converts dopamine into norepinephrine. So you end up with too much dopamine because it's not being converted into epinephrine, and the dopamine goes up, and you get tics. And that's associated with Tourette's. And we managed to get that down within the space of, relatively short space of time. So that was a gut. And the prognosis had been Tourette's. your kid's going to have Tourette's.
Mhm.
So we didn't resolve it fully, but the family stopped and went, okay, we get this now.
Mhm.
When he's older, we can deal with this. We've got it. We're under control. We're not shooting in the dark anymore. So that was a really good one. I thought I'd just go into that one. The next one was I think it was 11-year-old girl
Mhm.
with rage,
Mhm.
depression, severe anxiety, fear of death.
Mhm.
So psychologically located symptoms there. And this, I just want to make it a point that this wasn't my case study. This is somebody, a friend, somebody I know, and somebody I've trained with. So I just want to make sure I don't take the credit for this one, but I just thought it'd be a really powerful one.
Mhm.
They ran some lab work to try and figure out what was going on nutritionally. They did a hair tissue mineral test, and they showed that the copper levels were really high in that test. And high copper and or low zinc, that imbalance between copper and zinc can have a really profound influence on psychology and mind-based symptoms. They did something called a pyrrole test, which is a urine test. If the pyrroles are too high in the body, they strip out zinc and vitamin B6. So you get depleted in zinc and vitamin B6. So with this one, we had a high copper and we had low zinc. So the gap between the two was really high. And the B6 was depleted. Now, B6 is really important in pretty much all of the neurotransmitter pathways. It particularly with this case, it converts glutamate, which is highly excitatory, and it converts it into GABA, which is inhibitory. And so that was another. That was another. There were a few other things, but they were the two main ones. So very simple protocol: some B6, some zinc, and then some things to help bring the copper down, including molybdenum and glutathione. And within days, the symptoms calmed right down. And then she eventually just said, oh, I feel happy for the first time that I can remember. And so there you go. It's like magic sometimes. That's one of those classic cases where all of the ducks lined up in the lab work, and you could just see what it was immediately. Now, if anybody's interested, this approach actually, it comes from partly from a guy named Carl Pfeiffer, who was actually nominated for a Nobel Prize. He didn't get it. And then after he died, his lab went into financial difficulties and disappeared. And nobody's heard of him now, unless you get trained in the right schools. But there's a guy based on his work. There's a guy called Dr. William Walsh, and he wrote a book called Nutrient Power. I think everybody should go away and read that book. You don't have to understand the whole thing, but Walsh has a massive database of lab points of data, lab data, that are exclusively or mostly from people with psychological issues, whether they are for, just a minor anxiety or depression, all the way through to psychosis and schizophrenia.
Schizophrenia, yeah.
At the other end. And so he's noticed with these millions of data points, literally he has millions of data points, that certain patterns nutritionally and biochemically can be connected to certain conditions. And it's not a one-to-one fit. As always, as we've said, you're never that lucky. But B6 depletion is one. Zinc and copper balance is another. Methylation is another, which involves other B vitamins. Methylation, under methylation or over methylation can change the psychology. Heavy metal toxicity, oxidative stress. And oxidative stress just comes from inflammation, really. So if you have gut inflammation, you've got oxidative stress. If you have brain inflammation, you've got oxidative stress. And that's where in a molecule, there's a loss of an electron, and it becomes, it's called a free radical, and it becomes highly damaging to cells and cell structures and causes problems. And they're the main ones. Now, of course, there are others. Magnesium can be really important. The gut's really important, and the food's really important, because you've got to go in there and go, it's no good saying, oh, you've got oxidative stress and inflammation. You've got to find out why that's happening. So foods, infections generate inflammation, and then that translates to oxidative stress, and you have the dysfunction. And then these other nutrients all placed on top of someone's unique genetic predisposition and vulnerability. Some of us are more vulnerable to certain little metabolic pathways becoming dysfunctional than others.
Mhm.
And that's the work.
Mhm.
It's figuring it out for each individual person. But I highly recommend that book as an introduction. It's not massively technical. There's enough technicality in it for it to be really taken seriously. But it's not overbearing. And so some really cool stuff in there that people can just take away and have a look at.
Awesome, Dave. So good. So Dave, as we wrap up, can you give where people can find you in case they have
Yeah.
questions for you or want to work with
Yeah,
you?
we're building out the new website at the moment. But we've got a little landing page for people who have found me on a podcast guest appearance or whatever. And they can just go and leave their email address there, and no spam ever, only cool stuff. And that'll just keep people updated with potential new courses, other podcast appearances and things like that. So we'll keep the education going. And if they want to email me, if there's anybody out there at the moment who has some issues that they want to talk about, whether it's with themselves or family member or one of the wee ones, then emailing me directly at the moment is probably the best thing. Info at davehompes.com, HOMPES, info at davehompes.com. And I'll get back to you very
And then
quickly.
will you give the other website link, the one that's under construction?
Yep, highmindedhealth.com. Nearly forgot that.
Yeah.
highmindedhealth.com/PG for podcast guest.
And we'll put that all in the show notes as
Yeah.
well. Well, Dave, thank you so much. I just think this is such a beautiful addition to the puzzle for us as play therapists. Appreciate your knowledge, appreciate your time, appreciate you. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. It's been great to be here, and I really appreciate the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, play therapists, I hope you found that super interesting. I know I sure did. And if you have questions, again, you can reach out to Dave wherever you are in the world. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your guts. Let's go ahead and add that in. Take care of your nutrition. Let's add that into the mix today. You are the most important toy in the playroom. Until next time.